Hello, welcome to Emsi webinars. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited. We have a great webinar planned with Andy Durman and Emsi's new VP of Global Operations, and Duncan Brown, who is Emsi's Senior Economist. We also have a guest speaker today called a gentleman called Simon Haines, and he is from Simply Get Results. So if you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please put them in the questions box on your control panel, and we'll endeavour to get back to those at the end of the presentation. Please make a note that you will be receiving a follow-up email with the recording and the slides from today's presentation, so keep your eyes open for that. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Andy. Hi.
Hi Debbie, thank you very much, and hello everyone, thanks for joining us again. It's a very lovely, warm, sunny day here in Basingstoke, amazing Stoke, England. So thanks for joining us here, and good to have you alongside me again, Duncan. Hi Duncan.
Hi Andy, it's nice and sunny here in lovely Leicester. Great. As well.
This is a great country we live in. So yeah, no, thank you very much, and excited to introduce Simon to you later on in this webinar. So just before we get going, usual drill, thank you for the regular viewers, listeners, watchers, for joining us again, and for anyone that's new, just welcome, thanks for joining us, and feel free to peruse the back catalogue of such webinars on our YouTube channel, which we will circulate details of later on. So just for anyone that's new to us, just a quick intro about Emsi Burning Glass as an organisation. We're really driven by one clear mission, which is to help organisations better understand what's happening in the labour market, such that they can make the best possible decisions with the best possible information at their fingertips, whether that relates to the world of education, economic development or employment. And today's topic really digs into some of the value of peering deeply into the labour market and understanding what's going on and how that might influence how educators plan education provision and engage people around skills development, how economic developers can really leverage the skills and attributes and opportunities to develop their economy for the regional good. And of course, we will spend a good amount of time today thinking from an employer perspective about how trends in the labour market influence how employers can plan and develop their workforce and to be successful going forward. So very excited about the content we have today. So before we dive into the topic of the STEM agenda, as we have been now for many months, I almost say years now, Duncan, is to do a quick update on the latest statistics about the wider labour market. So I'm going to hand over to you to give us the good news.
Absolutely. I mean, you say it sort of for many months, it feels like years, which is often the effect I have on people, but we'll leave that there. Yeah, and to be fair, we didn't do this in August, did we? So we've got a couple of months of data to catch up on, and so we'll start with this one, which is the kind of the standard set of labour market headlines of unemployment, vacancies and redundancies. And yeah, I mean, the labour market is booming. I mean, it's the only way to call it, really. So if you look, you'll see that the sort of on the latest month of vacancies, and I've plotted it here because vacancies is a little bit more quickly published than the other two data sources, and you can see that we're kind of into unprecedented territory where sort of the vacancy rate is kind of nearing on 3%. So vacancies are counted as compared to the number of people in the labour market. And so yeah, there's enough jobs out there to take up 3%, which is more than half the number of unemployed people we've got at the moment. So it's a pretty kind of phenomenal picture. Unemployment is falling, continuing at the rate it has been over the last few months. Redundancy is well down now, sort of back to normal, non-recession type levels as well. And so if we go over to the right panel with the beverage curve, which of course I bring every time we do one of these just to confuse people. And so what this does is it's a sort of just a way to look at the efficiency of the labour market and the way it's tracking. So on the x-axis we have the unemployment rate, which is the one that we all know from the news and that's been reported for many years, and then on the y-axis there is that vacancy rate. And so normally we see the labour market moving on a sort of a diagonal line from sort of top left to bottom right-ish, and you can see that in the sort of the black, green and light blue dots there. That's what life was like before COVID, that we moved along there. When times were bad, we went down to sort of the bottom right of that area, which is that sort of the green line is the progress from 2006 to the end of 2009, to the end of the financial crisis. And then the black line is from the recovery all the way up to the Brexit referendum. And then the blue line is when we sort of carried on, but similar on that diagonal path in the few years after that, when the labour market surprisingly tightened to levels that were historically really kind of tight labour market levels. So we had an unemployment rate going into COVID that's kind of, I think, lower than it had been in my lifetime. And as you will vouch, Andy, I'm not that young. So the sort of the purple line then is what happened during COVID, and you see that kind of just massive collapse in vacancies, first of all the way down to a vacancy rate of 1%, so the lowest on record for this data. But unemployment didn't rise much at all, really, mainly because of furlough, and then it started to rise, but so did vacancies. And then sort of over the last few months, you can see that unemployment, so first of all, fell quite quickly and has continued to fall, but vacancies are just kind of surging ahead. And so we're kind of into unprecedented territory the other way now, where we've got lots of vacancies compared to the number of unemployed people. And so it's kind of a really sort of interesting setup, and it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out over the next few months, really, because at some point we're going to expect vacancies to start to top out, because there'll be a point where employers just decide that they can't get the staff. And at the same time, you hope to see unemployment falling. And so, yeah, it's an amazing picture compared to if you'd have asked me a year ago, would we be there now? I would never have guessed it. It's quite striking.
Yeah, fascinating. And it's easy to forget that pre-pandemic, of course, there were lots of conversation about how tight the labour market was and how it was difficult to find the skills that we were seeking. And of course, we got distracted for a while for obvious reasons, but we've returned almost with a vengeance. There's some degree of clearing out happened, movement happened, and we've heard a lot of anecdotal stories of perhaps EU workers heading back home to be with families, etc., during this period. And it's come back to an extreme level, as you describe.
Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, one of the ways that economists summarize labour market tightness is kind of the vacancy to unemployment ratio. And along that diagonal line, typically you're sort of talking, sort of significantly under half the number of vacancies compared to the number of unemployed. And now we're entering territory where we're much more like sort of 60-odd%. And so that vacancy to unemployment ratio has really surged, and that's kind of, that just shows you sort of how what we used to think of as a tight labour market is and is now manifested through all these stories that you've just mentioned, we're into territory that we didn't see even before the financial crisis, put it that way. So this is a familiar set of charts that we've been monitoring over the sort of most of this year, really, and these allow us to sort of look at the moving parts behind that labour market timing. And so just a reminder here, for each of these industry groups, the black line is the level of job postings compared to February 2020, so before COVID started, and then the green line is the share of the workforce which is in furlough. And so, in an ideal situation, we've seen the green line going to 0 and the black line going above the 100%. And indeed, that's where we're heading towards. And so you'll remember a few months back, if you go back to sort of when we were talking in May and June, the black lines in some industries were really struggling. Accommodation and food services was sort of, if you go back to kind of May of this year, was kind of around 50% of the level of February last year, and furlough was still taking out about half the workforce. And now we can see furlough is closing in on zero in most industries. In fact, pretty much all of them, even the ones that were biggest users like accommodation and food services and arts, entertainment and recreation. It's getting down to a sort of a small share. And pretty much every industry is now got more recruitment activity than it had in February 2020. And in fact, overall, we've got more recruitment activity than we had 2 years ago at the same time, to give you a sort of a seasonally adjusted comparison. And you see sort of transport, where vacancies are sort of more than 50% up on February last year. Accommodation and food services similarly. There's a real kind of sort of economy-wide boom in labour market demand. And finally now, so the furlough data go to the end of July, so the point where the economy was really beginning to open up in full force and people were starting to go on holiday and all of the kind of the consumer-facing services were opened up. And yeah, it's kind of, it is falling off. And if you look at the sort of the detailed furlough data, you see some real changes about how, for example, in the spring, sort of 20-25% of under 25 workers were furloughed, and now they're back, by far the highest group, and now they're sort of down at the kind of the 5% sort of level, along with the other age groups. And similarly, you can sort of see the way that back in the spring, the largest number of furloughs were on full furlough, and only a minority were on flexible furlough, and now it's pretty much 50-50. And so about half of those on furlough are fully furloughed, and the other half are flexible furlough, so just furloughed some days. And so you can really see we're getting to the kind of the last vestiges here. And of course, at the moment, we're going through a phased reduction of furlough availability, and in fairly short order, furlough will be gone entirely. And so we'll see what happens when that occurs, because there is this slight mystery that unemployment isn't higher. Job vacancies are actually booming, but employers are reporting difficulty finding people. But as of the end of July, we still have 1.6 million on furlough in some form. And that's an odd situation to explain, because if there's so many job vacancies out there and your job doesn't seem to exist because you're on furlough, at a certain point, knowing that furlough is going to end, you would expect people to start voting with their feet and going to those job opportunities that do exist. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see the sort of the last few months phase out of that, how much of that furlough activity sort of does represent masked unemployment versus relatively easily switched off state.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose one of the challenges with the different metrics that we're looking at here is that the official unemployment data has a bit of a lag built into it, doesn't it? And I think you have to have been actively seeking work for, is it 4 or 8 weeks or so before it gets counted. And so there may be a slight peak yet to be seen, but we will see.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, even if there is, it may not net out as an increase, because there may be other reductions elsewhere that are bigger. And it's interesting that even 4 or 5 months ago, I think there was a general expectation that as furlough ended, we would see a big increase in unemployment. But I think that's a lot more of a grey area now, and there may well be a blip up, as you say. But how much of one is really open to conjecture now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Duncan. Appreciate the update there and some interesting trends. And actually that influences a lot of what we've been thinking about recently and what we're coming on to think about now. So some of you may recall that we took a bit of a summer break from our monthly webinars, but prior to the summer, we were looking in at the green labour market, the green economy, and trying to understand what that looks like, and showing some interesting trends, particularly strong growth in demand for green skills right throughout the labour market, as well as within what we might call green jobs. So that was a fascinating exploration, and we wanted to build that out a little further to actually start to think about the wider world of STEM. We hear STEM mentioned a lot in discussions, in policy, in the news, in the world of education. And so we thought it might be helpful, much like with the green economy, to take some time to actually try and understand what do we mean by this when we hear the term. So we're going to today we're going to dig into that a little further and start to think about, well, what do we mean by the STEM labour market, and start to illuminate what's happening in the labour market around particular STEM jobs. And this is when we'll have chance to talk to our special guest today, Simon. But before I dive into that and hand back to you, Duncan, as we ponder those questions, I think what strikes me when we look at the data that you've just presented is, you know, in a simple, easy world, of course, it doesn't make sense that we have still people on furlough, yet vacancies are at a highest rate, and we have a good number of vacancies, but unemployment is not crazy high, but there's still a significant volume of folk that are in that, and something does not compute, as you say. It doesn't quite make sense. I think when we look at it in aggregate, it's easy to forget that, of course, the connections are made at, quite frankly, a job, skill, capability, and geography level. And so so I think what we're seeing here is, and this is the challenge, particularly when the labour market is so tight, is trying to understand how the pieces all fit back together in a different way, and they may not logically be doing so. And so I think it just reinforces why it's valuable, and hopefully it's valuable to you, that we dive into topics like green and STEM, and as we understand where that demand sits. This is, of course, why we do what we do. We want to empower organizations to have that information, so that if the jigsaw puzzle pieces don't quite fit, how do we shave a few edges off, add some new skills, develop people, and help them find a new route in? So I think it's just particularly pertinent, given the story that you've just told of the labour market, as to the importance of diving into the specifics, as we have been doing and will continue to do for you going forward. So with that in mind, Duncan, to talk to us about what STEM is. So, as I say, you hear about it a lot, particularly in policy circles, but what do we actually mean by STEM, and how are we defining it for the purposes of today?
So so STEM has been a big thing for sort of nearly 20 years, really, and I'm sure most people do know it's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics that it refers to. So it's a little bit, well, more than a little bit, it's quite a bit of an abstract kind of category that in some ways doesn't really exist in employers' minds as much as we sort of might think about the labour market in that way, because of course actually there are lots of employers who are after engineering people, lots of employers who are after math skills, lots of employers who are after science and technology skills, not so many who are after the whole lot. But the sort of, as you say, the skills and capability thing comes in here, because to some extent there is an overlap between these domains of science, technology, engineering, and maths, of certain kinds of skills that are very useful in all those different domains that individually want them. And so, we think about people with engineering skills being able to sort of move around between different environments. And we know, for example, that people will come out of a PhD program for a hard science, and often will end up working in a quantitative analyst role in a city investment firm, for example. And so that's kind of what STEM is getting at, that there are a range of demands in a sort of a 21st century economy that hit upon these family of skills that are advanced and knowledge intensive, that draw on the scientific method and engineering methodologies, and sort of a high expectation of quantitative ability, and that's what we touch on. I think for the webinar today, that's where we leave it. I think that there's a much broader question about the sort of the branches off from that, in terms of the individual sciences and engineering disciplines that sort of make it up. But that's kind of where STEM starts. And so here, the approach that we've taken to defining it is we've used the SOC occupation taxonomy, and we've looked at a range of occupations that have a strong science, technology, engineering, and mathematics dimension to them. Normally, there are certain branches off that are either included or not, depending on your flavour. So medicine is a sort of a controversial area with regard to STEM, because obviously it has a lot of scientific knowledge involved. but here we've kept that out, which is fairly common practice, and the same with people like me who are economists who hopefully have some mathematical ability, but are not kind of classically in the engineering and science space as well. So, but what you can see there are a lot of roles in the hard sciences, so things like physical scientists and chemical scientists. You can see digital roles, IT and telecoms directors, programmers and software developers. You can see technician and engineering roles ranging from electrical engineers to planning, process and production technicians, and a few others that are a bit more niche in terms of conservation work because of the science dimension there, environmental health and so on. So using the SOC taxonomy, we're able to kind of develop a footprint of what we think of as the STEM labour market, and that allows us to start cutting the data to just see what's going on really. And so if you go on to the next slide, I can sort of start to give you a flavour of that. So this is the sort of the recruitment activity that we see from job postings data going back to January 2016 to the most recent, and we have some colour coding to help us see sort of the first year of COVID in green there, with a huge falling off of labour market demand in STEM as elsewhere, and then a recovery over the past 6 months or so, where you can see that labour market activity is back up to the sort of the peaks that we were in 2019, and if anything, a little above them. The thing to say on this is that there's a lot of comment about the high demand for STEM. Overall, this trend is pretty much in line with the rest of the labour market, and that is the sort of the long-term picture, but also the picture over the past year. And of course, in some ways, though, that can be an interesting thing. Some of the parts of STEM that we can think of, including the engineering dimensions, over the long haul have actually seen some declines in employment as those sectors have become more productive and focused on fewer jobs. And so, and that's an important dimension to bear in mind, that STEM roles might be becoming more important without necessarily always seeming so additionally numerous. There are other aspects of the STEM labour market, if we think of digital roles, that have been especially buoyant, and we'll see that in a minute with the skills data. But yeah, overall the trend is not too dissimilar, but the main thing is that over this past year or so, you can really see from the sort of the trough that we saw last summer, where we've seen that huge falling off affecting STEM just as it had the wider labour market. We've seen months and months of almost undented progress. And one thing you notice is that the second lockdown didn't really make much difference to the STEM labour market. There are other parts of the labour market, accommodation jobs, for example, hotels and restaurants, which were hit hard at the end of last year and beginning of this year. But STEM jobs, which are often either sort of non-customer facing or work from home, since that initial shock back in late spring last year, have just gone from strength to strength in the recovery. Go on to the next one, and we can sort of see which of the jobs that have really been sort of dominating the recovery, and we can see quite a good mix actually. I was quite reassured by this, and again it kind of fits with our earlier discussion about the sort of the widespread nature of the labour market recovery, because we can see there's lots of IT roles in there, IT business analysts at the top. We can see specialist managers as well, and then further down we can see people like IT ops technicians. And but you look at those business analysts, they're growing at sort of more than 45% over the past year. So that's a really powerful change. You can see some of the harder science roles in there, so natural and social scientists and biological scientists. Of course, the biological ones are always going to be in highest demand here because of the COVID dimension there. But then you can also see some manufacturing and engineering roles, production managers there, very strong, adding about 5,000 postings in that time. Environmental professionals are in there, civil engineers. We're seeing construction industry in great form and has been for quite some time now. So a real mix, actually. Go on to the next one. This one's a much more interesting picture, I think, because whereas the other one showed a fairly broadly based recovery, when you look at the geography of it, it's a much more interesting picture, where you can see that sort of the more peripheral parts of the UK, and I mean that in a strictly economically geographic sense, and that I love the Northeast, I love Wales, I love Scotland, and I love Northern Ireland, but they are all further away from the economic centre of the country, which tends to be London and the Southeast. I've actually seen a really strong growth over comparing August of this year to August of 2019, so pre-COVID. STEM jobs in the Northeast are more than 80% higher in terms of the number of adverts out there. In Northern Ireland, nearly 40% higher. And yet, on the other hand, you see London, West Midlands, Yorkshire, and the Humber and the Southeast are all lower than they were 2 years ago. So that's a really interesting geographic aspect to this. That the economy is recovering, but it's not an even recovery. Well, the interesting thing is, as we've seen on the occupations and industries front, it is fairly even, but geographically it's not. And certainly with London, we know that there's a particular dimension to this, that London is still not kind of fully returned to normal on a day-to-day basis, because the presence of professional workers in London who can work from home and haven't returned to the commute, which of course is often quite a long commute for those workers, has really changed the dynamics of the London economy in a way that other regions have seen it much more of a return to normal. And so maybe that's got an effect there. But you can, as I say, you can see with West Midlands, it's really still some way back from where it was 2 years ago.
Fascinating.
So I think one last one here, which is to look at the skills. And so what we've done here is we've plotted the top skills by the share of postings that mention those skills in 2019, which is on the x-axis, and then the share of postings 12 months ago. And so, well, no, over the last 12 months, the most recent 12 months. And so we've got this diagonal line here. And so anything that's above the diagonal line has risen in importance among STEM jobs, whereas everything below the diagonal line has fallen in importance. And you see quite an interesting shift here, that the list is dominated by technology, by programming language, software, and so on. And that's because of the high presence of engineering and software engineering jobs specifically. But the shift is quite interesting, because you see a general shift towards a lot more of the cloud technology. So you see Amazon Web Services there, Microsoft Azure, you see demand for application programming interfaces, and all of those kind of things, and away from the more generic CSS, so which is used in forming websites, and HTML similarly, and then the more normal production languages, Java and C# down there, and SQL at the top. It's not to say that these aren't still important, but what you are seeing is a shift toward the production of cloud-based technology. And of course, as so many of us now work from home, including no doubt some of us on this webinar, certainly me, you can see the demand for those kind of services has gone through the roof over the past year. So many more of us order our groceries to get them delivered at home now, and that's all about cloud-based technology, not just when we're ordering them, but also the logistics behind it, of being able to change those orders into shopping bags that arrive at your doorstep. And so all of those put a much greater emphasis on those kind of technologies, and so you can really see that coming through in the demand for STEM workers.
Do we think, interesting and fascinating stuff here, Duncan, do you think that there is this connection between the geography and what you describe around the skills? Is it too soon for that kind of remote working push to be recognized geographically in volume terms, as you shared on the previous slide, or do you think these are all tied together?
Yeah, I think they're all tied together in part, but it's quite difficult to extract the signal from the noise. One of the things is that you can imagine, because traditionally, of course, a lot of the jobs that we're talking about, STEM is really important in London and West Midlands in different ways. At the high-tech software end, London is really important, whereas engineering more important in the West Midlands. On the technology side, though, I think one of the things I wonder about is the extent to which, and I know there's pretty good evidence on this in the US, for example, that a lot of those technology jobs would once have had very clear ideas about where they were based, because there'd be an office there, whereas the combination of people getting used to working from home and a very tight labour market, meaning you'll take workers wherever you can find them, may mean that the overall demand has held up, but the geographic mix has changed. And so we're seeing those big improvements in places like Northern Ireland and the North East, but often that's from quite a low base. And so to some extent that can be sort of real catch-up growth. London has meanwhile fallen, but it may be that some of the other demands are just not geographically specific. I mean, we have a number of job postings always that don't specify where the job is, and I guess that's one frontier that we can start to explore more, perhaps in a future webinar, which is, are we just seeing in certain kinds of labour market more jobs that are fairly open on location?
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. So I think this is a perfect time to sort of switch into thinking about that employer dimension. Sorry, I should add just quickly, if you want to summarize just some of those kind of key trends, and then we'll move into the employer dimension. So anything that you haven't already summarized, just to pick out from the slide here?
Yeah, I mean, really, just to kind of hammer home the main points, really, that recruitment demand is now in record territory, although that's pretty much in line with the wider labour market. That difference, as I say, is that it didn't drop off so much in the start of this year. That broad base in terms of occupation, but the regional pattern much less symmetrical. And then that point there about the shift toward cloud technology skills. I think, as I said at the start, the interesting dimension here about STEM is that in some ways it's a very broad category, and so the next sort of frontier in it may be to look into the details, and that might become more important in such a tight labour market with such labour shortages, that it's the kind of the various cutting edges that are at stake there.
And on that point, is STEM, whilst it's a term that we're familiar with, is it almost redundant now, and we should be thinking about the margins?
Yeah, I do kind of wonder that myself at the moment, and certainly we've got some research around a particular branch of science coming up in the near future that looks at that and helps to unpack one particular area. And I think certainly in terms of meeting skills challenges, it is actually kind of probably more useful to start drilling into what the particular dimensions of STEM are, because we know that although they are overlapping and sometimes useful in different settings, actually certain sciences and certain engineering disciplines have different advantages in different parts of the labour market, and so actually it's those margins that are probably where the greatest interest lies for the future.
Interesting. So as I was coming on to say, but that's just reinforced the switching of gears now to really thinking about that question. We've laid out some of those kind of key trends and that we've been seeing, and I'm delighted to invite our special guest for this webinar session, Simon Haines from Simply Get Results, friend of Emsi Burning Glass. We've worked together for a decent amount of time now together, and so welcome, Simon. Thank you for joining us, and please tell us a bit about Simply before we get into kind of thinking about what does this STEM analysis mean from an employer perspective.
Well, thanks, Andy. Hi, very, very good to be here, and thanks for including me. And firstly, let's just start by saying we are very, very proud user and partner of Emsi Burning Glass data, and have been for some time. And that's kind of the whole point here, is how are we turning data into value using our software for our customers. Look, very, very briefly, feel free to look up the website and learn a little bit more about the company. But as it says here, your software platform for skills, insight around skills, management of those skills, reskilling, upskilling, and planning. Really, we're here to help. We serve large employers across industries, companies you would know, like GSK, HSBC, BT, McDonald's. We serve senior HR and business leaders. And to go back to Andy, your purpose about all of this, it's to help them make the best possible decisions across the workforce.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I've really enjoyed our work together. I know you guys are only getting going, which is super exciting in terms of just what the possibilities are. But even at that only getting going, certainly bringing great insight and value to your customers. So we were keen not just to have a little Emsi burning glass simply loving, but we were keen to get your input really, as we talked about some of those themes and trends associated with the much fabled STEM term, and we hear that a lot, as I mentioned at the front, certainly in policy circles and planning circles. And so was really keen to kind of get that employer dimension. That's who you're serving, and you're ultimately trying to help employers to make better decisions around their workforce planning. And so help us understand here, Simon, from your perspective, how is the corporate world, what does it think of STEM? How is it thinking about STEM? Is it even thinking about STEM? Or as Duncan and I maybe surmised in that just before you joining us, that maybe it's a term for policymakers more than it is the real world. I'm interested to get your views on that.
Well, look, as you've said, this is a cluster of different skills and capabilities. And some organizations are going to, self-diagnose as very much, we are a science business. GSK, pharmaceutical company, that's how they see themselves, and that pervades the culture, the workforce, and everything about the organization. Similarly, businesses say we are an engineering business, whether it's mining or construction or whatever, companies say they are technology businesses. So, different organizations in different sectors are diagnosing as, yes, each of these skills is very important to us. But I've missed one, which is maths, and I'm sure there are organizations that would, self-label as a mathematical-led organization, although I would struggle to think about one. Maybe you guys can come up with one. But I think with mathematical skills and numerate skills, they're embedded in the workforce. Banking is a numerate profession, so there's a mathematical requirement across the financial services industry, whether it's a quant in a hedge fund or someone working in a branch. And tech skills similarly. Obviously, technology is everywhere, therefore tech skills are everywhere, whether you're a tech business or not. So I think companies break them out into their component parts and then ask themselves, what matters most for us?
Interesting, thanks. And we obviously hear greatly about skills gaps, and we're unable to find people, whether that's graduates or people in the workforce with the right skills. And we were talking right up front about one of the great challenges with the tight labor market is thinking about those how we transition people in. So again, when we hear those terms from the employer community about not being able to find the right skills, do you think it is the STEM side of things that really is driving that, or is it a different challenge, or is there a breadth of challenges that are sort of hidden under that surface?
Look, I think there's a breadth of challenges, but all under the category of we are at the start of a global skills crisis. I'm not the person saying that. We're all reading about it. It's read the World Economic Forum or any other serious body like that. But I think, the skills that are so the skills crisis means that there are greater skills gaps than ever. Why? Because the world just changed dramatically. The world changed in so many ways: consumer behaviors, ways of working, competitive activity. That's driving skills gaps. On one hand, you see skills gaps around delivery drivers. On the other hand, you see struggling to hire, deep technical specialists. So skills gaps, and specifically in the STEM world, which is obviously what we're here to talk about, are across the board. And one of the things that we're helping our customers with, and I know this is the same for you and the rest of your colleagues at Emsi Burning Glass, is how do you use data to explore different opportunities to close those skills gaps? An example being, if you take a civil engineer, and if you've exhausted all your typical sources for civil engineers, and this is a very real world situation, how do you break the skills associated with civil engineering into their component parts and maybe source them differently? Does it need to be all of the traditional skills wrapped up in a single individual, or can you break them down across teams, and can you find different sources for those skills? Can you look at adjacent skills to your comments earlier about whether you're a science grad, a science PhD, now working as a quant in a hedge fund? Can you look at adjacent skills? What does that do for closing skills gaps? So again, data, insight, and looking at real world situations. What are your skills gaps and how can you close them?
Yeah, awesome. That's exciting stuff. And of course, as the labour market gets ever more complex, we have to look into more complex ways of solving problems. And talking of that, you've undertaken some research recently. Do you want to share a little bit about that work with us?
Yeah, look, happily. So we were very proud to be featured in KPMG's latest global Future of HR research. And while that's a topic about HR skills, actually our research and our findings were a little broader. They were about winning skills, what we're calling winning skills in general. What do I mean by winning skills? I mean, of all the skills that are out there, which are you choosing in your company, in your team, in your department? Which of those, the plethora of skills out there, are you choosing that make a difference for you, for your company, in your market? And what our analysis found is that, if you take any industry, engineering, pharmaceuticals, banking, whatever it might be, if you take any industry and look at the common skills across, a peer group, they've got a whole bunch of really obvious skills in common because those are the skills that you need to sort of turn up and do the job. But then if you look a bit deeper and you look at what I call the long tail of additional skills that companies are recruiting for and building in-house, you find that really different choices are being made from one company to the next. Companies that are direct competitors are making different choices about which skills to invest in. And we think it's those specific choices that are really making a difference. And that's why we're calling them winning skills and really doubling down on the research and analysis around that.
So fascinating, and there's a link on the screen right here, but we will send a link round with the follow-up email as well, so hopefully you can get digging into that, because I think it's a fascinating piece of research. Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. So as we round this off then, I note the subheading of the winning skills advantage, of course, is about key lessons from what we're seeing. So you've kindly prepared a number of kind of takeaways and tips that from your work with employers you were keen to share. And of course, the Emsi Burning Glass community is broad, as you know, in terms of the worlds of education and government and policy and regional economic development as well. So fascinated to think about those tips, not just from an employer perspective, but also the organizations represented here are also key to supporting those employers. So yeah, please do share some of those your six key messages with us.
Well, do you know, how about if I break from the norm, and these messages are on the screen and they're in the report, so go read if you would like to, if they're of interest. But look, to your question, Andy, for you do have a wide group of participants on the webinar. So what might some of the common things be? Just to throw a few things in there. Firstly, you got to get specific around skills. It's not at all helpful to say digital skills. It's not meaningful. You have to break digital down into its component parts and look at what digital might mean in the marketing department versus in the finance department versus somewhere else. So the first thing is to be specific about skills. And obviously Emsi Burning Glass data is so useful to do that, to break capabilities into their component parts, to break roles into skills, and to really understand what's going on. Secondly, obviously, you've got to ask yourself the questions: what skills do we need? What skills do we have? What's the gap, and how do we close them? And that's it's really obvious to say that, isn't it? But organizations of all sorts and industries and shapes and sizes are struggling with those questions. What skills you need is typically driven from strategy. What are the skills that will execute our strategy, differentiate us in the market, and we will be successful if we have them? So go and answer that question. What skills we have is equally difficult to answer, and this is where we're looking at estimating and inferring skills from role data that you already have to give you a good view, a good approximation of the skills you might have. And then how do we close them is about typically the build or buy decision. Are we going to go hire for this skill? Where? From which source? At which price? Are we going to develop this skill in-house? From where and in which way? So I won't dig into these too much. I would just throw those sort of three common tips in, if that's of any use.
Absolutely fine, and absolute gem. And I hear you on the specificity, and of course is driving why we do what we do, and particularly the skills, the open skills library that we've developed and continue to develop based on what we're seeing in the labour market and evolving that, because until we can get specific, it becomes impossible to solve problems, right? As you say, digital skills, or even just simply saying there's a skills gap. You might be stating the bleeding obvious, but no one can do anything when there's just a skills gap, or we need more digital skills. We can only really drive action when we get specific, and I think that's a fantastic reminder to us as to why we need to do that, and why data about the labour market is filling that hole. It has to, because it needs to be so specific. Simon, thank you for being generous with your time and your knowledge and your resources, and thanks for the work that you're doing. And we're super excited by how you're translating our data into real action that's making a big difference in some of the major employers around the world. So thank you very much for your work. We maybe have time for one or two questions. So Debbie, just bringing you back in, are there any questions that have emerged that might be relevant to Simon's piece that we can quiz him on?
Yeah, we tend to have more on the furlough and vacancies rather than on Simon's piece. So I mean, we can cover a couple of those, or we can just leave those and get back to people in an email. What would you like to do, Andy?
Yeah. Well, why don't you throw one or two, and I'm sure Duncan's not fallen off his chair or fallen asleep somewhere. So maybe you can answer one or two of those.
Okay, all right. Well, it's just a comment here. I think it would be interesting to compare this, which I presume is the furlough data, with how many people are actually in work, and compare them with the vacancy and furlough rate. Are the vacancies being advertised to backfill the staff that have left the industry, or is the industry experiencing significant growth? Is there any way we can kind of delve into that?
It's quite a difficult question until furlough ends. So the sort of the weird thing with furlough is that it's meant, and this is by design, and is entirely for the good, that you have workers in industries that are not unemployed. They are working in those industries, but they're not actually at work, and so that leads to this strange sort of situation where all the data are misleading in a way.
Mm.
But in terms of the backfilling question, that's a really difficult one to know. It's only from speaking to the industry that you'd actually begin to get a feel for that. Because, of course, all we see with job postings data is that they are advertising jobs. Some of that can be entirely new, some of it can be to replace others. But, leaving aside the furlough aspect, which, as I mentioned, does sort of distort the figures, I think overall, a lot of it's the fact that we're seeing such robust growth in recruitment demand across the board, even in industries that we know weren't that badly affected on employment. So, there are certain industries like hotels and restaurants, which we know probably have shed quite a few staff because some businesses have just closed down and so on. So to some extent, there is kind of a catch-up aspect of that. But then there are other industries which are, like construction, which have been, they were hit hard initially with COVID, but even by like last autumn, they were kind of getting back to normal. And all of the kind of things you hear are that the industry is in sort of massive demand, and to try to get a builder at the moment, I can tell you it's really hard. So in those industries, the fact that they're seeing such growth, it just shows you that it's not simply a matter of backfilling in general, even if there are particular cases where that is true.
Right. Okay. And then, so how do you think education needs to change in order to meet these skills gaps that we've been talking about, and sort of at what level? So secondary, FE, HE.
Yeah, Deb, I'd like to throw that one at Simon, actually, if that's okay, because I think, as someone who is not professing to be from the world of education, but clearly a lot of the work that you're doing is highlighting the whole build, buy, loan in type approach. So do you have any thoughts from a structural education perspective, secondary, further higher education, based on what we're seeing with employers? Are there some obvious wins or obvious areas you think the education system, the more mainstream education system, can work more effectively for the world that you're seeing in your customers?
Yeah, well, look, we take at Syndicate Results, we employ a lot of young people and give people a start in their careers from secondary school through to postgrads. So we employ a lot of young people, and our customers obviously do as well. They take on all sorts of again, school leavers, undergrads, grads, postgrads, experienced hires, etc. And I think the key thing that the education system in the United Kingdom is doing right now that is fantastic is it's diversifying the way you can progress as an individual through life, if you like. So, 20 odd years ago, perhaps, there would be some more traditional paths. If you want to do this, you will go to university, then you will join that graduate scheme. And I think, given all the various approaches of apprenticeships, of studying for a degree while being employed, of going from school straight into employers that would have previously only hired grads, I think that diversification helps everybody. It absolutely helps the individuals, the young people, or whatever age they may be when they're starting their careers. But it very much helps the employers, and so I think as a result it helps our society. So I think that diversification is fantastic.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So thank you for those questions. I think hopefully we've grouped them together nicely, but we will have a look through and see if there is anything more. Just a reminder, really, as we close out this session, of course, we talk about these things because ultimately it's our business to help with these challenges, whether that's helping your organizations directly through the services we have, or working through great partners like Simply as a route to getting the information and the insight from the data into different realms. And so just a reminder, of course, that we are here to help, and we share this because we want to help you understand how, by having data like that Duncan shared with us and more, is really going to be critical. And to Simon's point, that the need to get specific, and so there's a wealth of insight that lies within our labour market data, and just want to remind you that of course we are here to help, and we have a range of services that can help you get access to that information. So if you're pondering some of the challenges and the questions on the screen, or it's encourage you to think about your own work that you're doing and how you can be more impactful, then please do reach out. We'd love to hear from you and explore how we can help. We have a number of other webinars coming up over the coming weeks. Our further education team are leading on a couple of webinars aligned to curriculum planning season that we're heading into now. A lot of colleges and training providers busy planning and thinking about their provision, and of course we are keen to help much in like the topics discussed today to illuminate the realities of what's going on in the labour market, so that those programs can give students, whether new entrants to the labour market or the retraining needed, to align those skills to in-demand opportunities. So Anthony will be leading a couple of webinars in the coming weeks that are thinking about how labour market data can support curriculum alignment over the coming weeks, a series there. I also like to provide some early insight to an interesting collaboration that we are doing with our friends at Get My First Job, who some of you may be familiar with and work with, as we bring forward some research in the coming weeks as we try and understand some of the labour market puzzles that we've reflected on today. So there'll be a webinar, data still to be confirmed, probably early November, the next in our series, where we'll be digging into some of that joint research with David over at Get My First Job. So excited to bring that forward, and you'll see more about that through our blog, but also on our webinars page, so keep an eye on that. And I think that is us for today. I just want to say a massive thank you, Simon, for joining us and providing your great insights. And as I say, thank you for the work that you do. Of course, Duncan, thank you very much for the insights you've presented, and Debbie for hosting us so admirably once again, even if it is a bit rainy in Northern Ireland. So thanks, guys, appreciate it, and look forward to speaking to everyone again very soon.
Okay.